There you go. I've been doing a series on Jewish theology because many people ask so often, what does Judaism believe? What should I believe? Are my beliefs Jewish? I oftentimes say, I can almost guarantee that unless you're a complete raving lunatic, some Jew with authority believes what you're believing now, and even some completely raving lunatic Jew in authority believes what you have. So the question is not, has someone in authority of the Jewish religion ever believed what I believe? Let's just go ahead and say yes. The question is, what is the nature of beliefs, and what does it mean to have a belief about God or anything else? I want to dilate just on that point a little bit. So I'm very influenced by theories of language, very characteristic of modern linguistic thought. There's a long history behind what I'm going to share with you, but I think it goes back into mystical thought, rabbinical thought, and so forth. And that is the idea that language mediates between the unconscious and the conscious. Now, when I say mediate, I mean it is kind of a symbiotic experience, meaning it's not just that language expresses what is at the pre-linguistic level. That used to be a dominant theory. It was already not theoretically sound when I was in graduate school and studying theory of interpretation and theory of language, but rather language actually shapes the unconscious world, which means we can't have a sense of self or thought without language. So on one hand, we are, as it were, stuck inside of language, even as we use language to try to express ourselves. The language that we use then goes back and shapes our interior lives. This is sometimes called the hermeneutical circle, meaning since we are placed somewhere in language, somewhere in history, and therefore what we say is completely conditioned by, you might say, what we've received, where we are in this circle. Can I break out of being a 21st century English speaker, native speaker, American, born into the Western liberal tradition, strongly shaped by Judaism? I could go on and on and on, but the question is, can I have thoughts that are not already embedded in the world in which I came into consciousness? Have not all the concepts, language, and ideas already been presented to me? So there can one have capacity, actually as it is, to transcend your starting place and say things that are new, original, and important, or are we always reflecting the world in the linguistic world into which we were born? It's not an important idea to put one foot in front of the other and just live your life. But if you take the world of ideas seriously, if you take the study of Torah seriously, if you take the study of philosophy seriously, if you're trying to figure out your life, you come down to this point: I'm using thoughts to figure out my life. Where do these thoughts come from? Now, there is a school of thought that I reject entirely, that the brain is simply a physical organism with pretensions of consciousness, and then everything's predetermined since the Big Bang. I reject that as utterly absurd and meaningless because it solves no important human problem. And number one, there's no evidence for it. So not only is it irrelevant and unimportant, it's highly misleading. So I know some people say that. I just reject that out of hand. So let's go back to thoughts that actually do make a difference for us. The next part of this problem is, let's say that as I'm born into, I come into consciousness, into this linguistic world, I know that as I've been presented with ideas, something in me says, well, that idea is wrong. That idea is absurd. So something in me is assessing ideas as I go along. So I experience myself, right? And if one of the tests of reality is human experience, I experience myself as not only have freedom of will, but freedom of thought. Not just political freedom of thought, meaning there's something in me that when I think deeply about things, I'm not just repeating what I've learned, what society has told me, what my religion has told me. There's actually something in me, a very mysterious part of me, very mysterious part of you, that is actually using the language you've been given, the ideas that you've been given, and that you are then producing your response to them. And it's not just a regurgitation of what you learned somewhere. It's actually something original based on your thinking. So that's why I think it's very important If you ever asked me a question, what does Judaism believe? I say Judaism has a very wide diversity of ideas. The question is, what do you believe? And it's worthwhile spending some time on what you believe. It's well-used time for a reflective person. And if anything, we have any common denominator of those who show up for orator services, it's that we are a group of reflective people or connected to a reflective person who's making us sit here today. So whichever one you are, here you are. And my adjuration to all of you is, let's be reflective about those things. So Jewish theology, you might say, is an organized way to be reflective about the idea of the divine. So that's my, as it were, definition of Jewish theology. There is no a Jewish theology. There is Jewish theology as a kind of language that we use with each other as we try to figure these things out. The second thing I've been saying all along here is that Judaism is not focused on the idea of God. One reason is there are so many competing ideas of God throughout the Bible, throughout rabbinic literature, throughout mysticism, Maimonides, into the modern period. There is no one Jewish idea of the divine. So it is impossible to say the Jewish idea of God. One can say, what are the various ideas of Jewish ideas of God, even for people who do not try to say it in an organized way. Here's another problem that we have. The Bible doesn't set out and say, here's our theory of God before we use the word. In the beginning of God's creating the heavens and the earth, the Bible doesn't say, footnote, here's what we mean by God. Here's what we mean by Elohim. So what does when the Bible uses the word Elohim, what does it mean? We can only infer what it means. And of course, we're bringing our understanding of what God is before we even open the text. This is a very important part of modern linguistic theory, especially that of Hans-Georg Gadamer, Gadamer. Even if you don't read his books, it's good to read an article on him. He says, all interpretation already starts before you start to think. All interpretation already starts before you open the book. The minute you open, let's say, the Bible, and it says, in the beginning of God's creating, you don't come at it with a blank slate. There's already something organized that even if you've never considered the idea, just because you live in a milieu where language is used, you already have a lot worked out unconsciously when you come to the word. So now the question is, as for example, as we study this idea, and then I think from a proper Jewish study perspective, one asks oneself, how is the word used in other contexts? It's a very, very prized way of studying text. I think in general, but certainly when it comes to the Bible, the rabbis rest on this idea. If you want to know what a word means in the Bible, the rabbinic literature, look at how it's used elsewhere. So what you find out is words don't have meanings. For example, the word God. The word is used in a variety of contexts to offer a meaning. So the word Elohim, for example, does not arrive with a meaning intact. It's used throughout the Bible to communicate a meaning. And the word Elohim is not used in a stable way. So if one were to say, what does the word God mean in the Bible? I'll say, which pasuk, which book, which chapter, what's going on? And especially, what seems to be the agenda of the author. Now, we can never recover the intention of an author of some part of the Bible. We'll just assume that at some level, a text is intentional. Somebody writes a text. They might not be fully aware of what they're doing, but they're trying to communicate something. So when we talk about Jewish theology, main thing I want to share with all of you is that it is surprisingly deep and complex and nuanced. It's not a simple thing. So if you're asking, what does Judaism believe? What do I believe? You are opening up a door to a lifetime of reflection and study. And for those of us who are thoughtful, reflective people, it's a profoundly productive and rewarding kind of thought, because I think the soul is nourished by this kind of thinking. If you have the kind of soul that is seeking, the more you reflect on these things, I think the more we fill the soul. And from my perspective, which is a somewhat Jungian perspective, the soul is starving for meaning. From a Jungian perspective, many of us suffer deeply because we have an aridity of meaning within. We live in a desert of meaning. And the only way that we can fill the soul with meaning is using our souls, our minds, language, reflection, text, community, to fill the inner life with meaning in this ongoing process of what it means to have a meaningful life. By the way, just to fill that out, meaning and values are deeply intertwined. From meanings and values, you might say you come up with life purpose. From a general sense of life purpose, you come up with your mission in life. And from your mission in life, you come out with tasks, which means things you need to do and not do. So for me, there is a movement between working out meaning, arriving at purpose, figuring out what your mission is at any given moment in your life, and then what specific tasks are in front of you, things you ought to do and not do, as we track back from task to mission to purpose to meaning. So everything that I'm doing here for me fits in with what it means to have a life of meaning. So I've addressed the idea of creation, and my point in studying creation is the idea that God creates ex nihilo, God creates out of nothing, is not what the Bible teaches, and secondly, from a spiritual perspective, almost is meaningless. So if one says, God created the universe, okay, that's fine. Person says, well, I don't believe in God. The one who believes says, well, where did everything come from? Person says, it's always been there. Okay, tie. We're not going to figure it out. Has anything been accomplished? One person says God creates the universe. One person says there is no God. It's always been this way. It takes about a minute to get through that one. From my perspective, nothing really gets accomplished there. Because for the person who says, before the Big Bang, there was the divine consciousness that produced the universe, I said, that's really interesting. I love the beauty of the idea, that everything in the physical world was put into motion by this divine consciousness, and it all, and it all comes down, whether it's 30 billion years or 15 billion years, whatever the new date is, it all arrives where the atoms that are swirling around and swirl into molecules and create I and create me and create you, we're back to where we began. We're right here. I'm a conscious human being. You're a conscious human being. However we got here, whether these molecules and atoms have always been here or came into being at a given time, we're still here. We still got to figure out what this thing means. We still have to figure out what to do. Now, it's very important in the Middle Ages to talk about God as creator. I don't find that important. I'm just going to start with, well, I'm here. You're here. I don't know exactly how we got here, but I know we have to fill it with meaning and purpose, especially filling our lives with meaning. That seems to be a singular endeavor for reflective people. A meaningful life, from this perspective, is a profoundly painful life. It's a life of loneliness. It's a life of despair, unless you can fill and work out meaning in life. By the way, this is not for everybody. I was just recently at a Board of Rabbis conference, and I was one of the presenters, and I engaged with many other people, and some were very focused on talking about problems of the day, and I remembered myself being a teenager in existential anguish, who went to high holidays every year since I was in seventh grade. I went to high holidays when I was overseas, and I never heard anybody address my existential anguish. I never heard that it was a thing. I read existentialism. I just didn't know that there were Jews who felt existentialist anguish until I began reading Jewish existentialist philosophers. So this might not be meaningful to you, this idea of working out meaning to address existential anguish. I guarantee somebody the life of someone is lived exactly at this point. And it might even be a young person that you know. It might be someone in high school or college who's trying to figure this thing out and is in some kind of existential despair. They need to know that our tradition addresses this full on. And it was a true relief to me when I realized, I was not alone in this. Many of you people have felt this relief as well. We're not alone in the sense of existential despair, trying to find what all this means, and then finding there's some direction to it. So I like to just pass by the question of creator, and this is a very existentialist approach, and arrive here now. Now that we are here, what does it all mean? So I put aside the question of creation as an important question, fascinating question, leads to a lot of poetic imagery. It doesn't fully address our present life circumstances. Now, the next thing I talked about was revelation, which means assuming that there is, first of all, a better and worse, morally speaking, as a metaphysical fact, meaning right and wrong is not human consensus. That's an atrocious idea. It makes no sense whatsoever. To say that right and wrong is a consensus, it actually eviscerates the meaning of right and wrong. Right and wrong means something is morally better and worse, regardless of what you think, regardless of what your society thinks. So if one were to say morally right and wrong depends on society, there is no theory of right and wrong. It's just a sense of what a societal preference is. There's no moral dimension to it. So intrinsic of the word morally better and worse is that it's not subservient to human will. Otherwise, everything anybody does is morally right or wrong, not just in their opinion, which is obvious, but also metaphysically right and wrong. Anything any nation decides to do, if what is moral depends on what society says, you can never critique, past, present, or future, what any society has ever done. If it all depends on how the society feels, there is no human rights. I mean, rights language in general is absurd because if 51% of the people think it, then it's obviously right. Unless one has a theory of morally and better or worse that transcends human consciousness and human will. It's a difficult idea. I can't solve it. But for me, the decision is pretty stark. Either there is no morally better and worse, and rights language, for example, is just nonsense. I find that idea repugnant, by the way. There are very smart people who believe it. I mean, the Yuval Harari wrote the book *Sapiens*. He begins his book just scoffing at the idea that metaphysical ideas have any reality. He's a very smart guy, a lot of great insights, but that first part of the book, I was taken aback that someone clearly this smart and seems to be a very good guy. I wonder if he actually believed it. In fact, I'm now sure that if you know the book I'm talking about, it was a very big hit. I'm sure he didn't mean it. I'll tell you why. He's taken a very firm stand in the Israeli political cultural issue of the judicial reforms. He's taken a stand that some things are right and some things are wrong. I won't go into what his stand is. But as I read his speeches, it's not speeches of a relativist who says all this right and wrong language is nonsense. He's taken a stand. Now, I don't know if he's going to go back and rewrite his books, but I always have a suspicion that when a person writes that right and wrong is all nonsense, when you find something they care about, something, the language of right and wrong, morally better and worse, is essential, is part of who they are. So when people say they don't believe there is morally right and wrong, my first instinct is, I don't believe you, and I'll find out when we discover something you care about. So that's my private theory. I can't demonstrate it. I just want to be frank with you about a bias that I have. So we start with the idea of revelation. Well, what is revelation? First of all, somehow, what is metaphysically better and worse arrives into the soul of human beings. Of course, we disagree greatly. Of course, from our perspective, some people, some societies, some nations get it terribly wrong. But the idea that there is morally and better or worse lodges inside of us. It is a metaphysical idea that appears in a physical form. I mean, we are spiritual beings, having a physical experience, and part of what it means to be a spiritual being is have an inherent natural sense that there's morally better and worse. I consider that the beginning of what we might call revelation. How does the metaphysical world reveal itself into human consciousness? I talked about thoroughly a few weeks ago. And then one builds on that slowly. Something, I think that's the necessary starting point. That's the minimal theology that you need to do to proceed through human life with any, in my mind, meaning or integrity. And then you build on it further. I came to rest last week when I think about an idea of revelation that I discovered through my studies of the Cambridge Handbook of Jewish Theology. This is called a post-liberal, or what I will call postmodern idea. I didn't know that it was until I read it. And what that means is the idea of revelation that I shared last time, which is a community working within a certain canon, textual tradition, looking for moral guidance in the text, even as we bring our moral concerns to the text. The text reveals its moral concerns to us in the context of a community, so that something called God's presence and God's will begins to appear. Now, why is this postmodern? Why is this, as it were, post-liberal? I don't like the idea of post-liberal. I consider myself, at my core, a liberal in the classic sense, meaning a government rooted in human rights, rooted in inordinate concern with minorities and so forth. So a political regime rooted in human rights is what I would call the liberal state, whether you're left, right, or center. So I'm not post-liberal. So in trying to figure out what this meant, it goes beyond the idea of the autonomy of the individual. It was a Kantian idea, meaning when you, as it were, surrender yourself to community search for meaning, Kant might say, you're no longer autonomous. And the response to Kant is, you've never been autonomous anyway. We always find meaning in, you might say, the culture of a group. By the way, you know who championed this idea was the Kantian, post-Kantian Josiah Royce. If you've ever wandered around UCLA and seen Royce Hall, look up Josiah Royce. He's one of the most important post-Kantians, so in the Kantian tradition who transcends it. And he wrote very important thought. And unless you bumped into the thought of he was an American pragmatist, he's forgotten about and highly worth studying. Why do I know about Josiah Royce? Because I was walking through UCLA and I said, who is this guy? And I went and looked at him and I said, well, he's an important guy. Maybe we'll study Josiah Royce sometime. So this is understood to be, according to the Alan Brill, who wrote the 14th chapter of Cambridge Companion to Jewish Theology. He says this is postmodern, meaning it's not the modernist idea of that the liberal state and liberal discourse defines everything. Is post-liberal, meaning post-Kantian. So for me, it rests on the idea of freedom of speech, the liberal state that doesn't impose a religion and so forth on people. So we're autonomous, but from his perspective, those who find meaning in the study of the canon, meaning the text that describes some faith group, when you enter into the study of the canon, the Bible, the Midrash, the Talmud, etc., as you enter into that, you're open to meaning being developed right in front of you. And if one believes in the divine, as it were, appears in a non-propositional way, which means you don't hear specific things in your head of what to do or not to do. Something like attitudes take shape. I know the times when I've been in a true dilemma in life, and I really just submitted myself. I prayed for God's guidance. I didn't hear voices. What I felt was a kind of a centering took place in my life, as if my soul found a compass. So do I pray to God for direction? Yes. The answer is not words. The answer is not a pasuk from the Bible. The answer is, as it were, I find myself on sign of a compass and I know where north is. I know what the direction is. And then the question is, do I have the wisdom, the will, etc., to follow that path? So I felt that before. But of course, I'm working inside of a tradition into which I've devoted myself. And so I speak to the tradition. The tradition speaks to me. I talk to other people. So when Alan Brill discussed that this is a post-liberal, postmodern idea of revelation, I said, well, that's where I am. So now I want to talk about the idea of redemption, just to fill this out. I might only do it today. I might give it one more shot next week. The idea of redemption comes under the rubric, under the topic of God's presence in history. Emil Fackenheim has a book called God's Presence in History. I've reviewed this literature, and it takes us back to a core dilemma of people who believe that there is a divine. Does this divine act in history? Now, according to our archetypal story of God acting in history, the Exodus from Egypt, it's a very interesting story to read. Because when you think about it, God is willing that the Israelites be freed from Egypt, but Pharaoh must let them go. Moses keeps walking to Pharaoh and says, Shlach et ami, let my people go. Pharaoh says no. God empowers Moses to inflict the plagues upon Egypt, some inflicted directly by God, some by Moses. That's not our point here today. But notice, God's redemptive power seems to be held in the will of Pharaoh. What a fascinating idea. Who wrote this story? Why, where, when, to what effect? Because one could say if God wants to get the people out of Egypt, get the people out of Egypt. What does Pharaoh have to do with it? So it seems that the story is not as much as about God's redemptive power, but I would say even more about human recalcitrance. Meaning it's not so much about God and God's care for slaves. That's obvious throughout the ethical dimension of Torah literature. It's about what is blocking God. So therefore, I think the idea of studying the spiritual idea of Pharaoh is not far off of the Bible's intention. Because what is in the way of the liberation, what is in the way of God's redemptive power in history? According to this story, and again, it's a beautiful myth, it's a beautiful narrative, one person. One person. You might say the channel of this great channel of God's will comes down to one point, and there's the dam that God cannot break through. It's not until Pharaoh's will is broken that God's will gets through. So when I read this book that says God's power in history, and then you read our archetypal story, again, as I've been saying about creation and revelation, it's much more complex than we might think. Because it is human beings that stand in the way of the redemptive power in our archetypal story of redemption, which is the Exodus from Egypt. So you have God on one side, directing the prophet coming to Pharaoh, and everything is stuck until Pharaoh agrees. And why does Pharaoh agree? Because he's been battered. There's no sense that Pharaoh might have free will to make the suffering stop. I mean, he could have been, he was very close to saying, you kill me if you want, I'm not agreeing to this. That would be kind of a heroic character that says, you're not scaring me, you're not hurting me, you can kill. This is like the Japanese at the end of World War II. The Japanese army said, kill everybody, we don't care, we're not surrendering. So Pharaoh seems to be that kind of a guy. Drop atom bombs on all of Egypt, I'm not surrendering, which is what the Japanese military wanted to do, by the way, at the end of World War II. How Japan surrendered is a very interesting story. I reread about it again because the commemoration of Hiroshima just occurred, of course, on August the 6th, if I'm not mistaken. In any case, so then when you go on from that, does God reveal God's self in history? It depends what side you're on. In fact, you've got to read this. How serendipitous for my topic for today. So I'm reading the New York Times, and I see an opinion piece by Ross, I say Douthat, I'm not sure how he pronounces his name, Routhat. He has an entire article on God's power in history. It was so random. I mean, it was like, did God put that here for me? Are Ross and I on the same wavelength? It was an interesting kind of meandering article. But he, I'll share with you one little point that he had. And he said, I'm summarizing and making simple something very complex. Is it something in God's plan that religion be limited? Meaning, it's kind of from a Hegelian perspective, that history goes through stages. Was there a stage when Christianity was needed in the Western world to overcome paganism? Let's assume you say yes. And then, as any thoughtful historian, Christian knows, terrible things have been done in the name of Christianity. Terrible massacres, crusades, and so forth. So Christianity is a highly imperfect form of a vessel for God's will. And so I think Hegel would say this, and I'll say Ross because I don't know how to pronounce his last name. He would say, was there a point that God's will was that the grip of Christianity be broken? It's a fascinating question. So he presents the 30 Years' War. The 30 Years' War was this internecine conflict between Protestantism and Catholicism, where 5 to 8 million people died over a 30-year period, which put religion itself in such a bad light that not only did the Protestant Catholic thing get worked out for a little while, the carnage, according to many historians, convinced people that religion is evil. The idea that religion is behind all wars, that's actually not true, but it was behind the 30 Years' War. And that was a war that devastated Europe. Some people say, well, a lot of the battles happened in Germany, which of course is half Protestant and half Catholic. 50% of Germany, what we would call Germany today, was depopulated during the 30 Years' War. So soon after the 30 Years' War, you might say religion just fell. And Dutat says, and that was a good thing. It was time for religion to go. And the question is, was that God's will to break the power of religion so that the liberal state could emerge? What a fascinating idea. Now, a person responded to him, and it said, well, that depends on what you believe about God and what you believe about religion, and which religion is better, Catholicism or Protestantism. There's a lot of, pre-beliefs that are there, but I've entertained this notion idea. Again, I'm not comfortable with it. I can't defend it. I don't even like the idea. But there seems to be an historical progression toward the liberal state, meaning a state formed to protect the rights of human beings. I see that as a purpose of history, is to work that out. Now, part of that, and again, I'm on really dangerous ground here, probably with most human beings. When you look at the 20th century, what has been the singular force that has ensured that the liberal state not be extinguished has been the United States of America. In fact, just having been in Germany and talked to people about the war in Ukraine, which of course for them is incredibly close, Germans have said to me and Rob, had it not been for the United States, Russians would have already taken Berlin. Nothing could stop Putin on restarting at World War II. He would have rolled right through Eastern European armies, rolled through the German army, taken Berlin, invaded Scandinavia, and that would be horrible for the world. So they're saying the United States has saved us. There's a strong sense, whatever you feel about this, the war, did we provoke Russia by bringing NATO to their borders? There's all kinds of problems. From the perspective of every German with whom we spoke, Europe has been saved again by the United States. And so for all of our imperfections, for all our disastrous foreign policy decisions in the Middle East, ISIS was only destroyed because of the United States. When we pulled out of Iraq, ISIS came in. We had to go back. Okay? So now then I say to myself, and this sounds very kind of jingoistic, manifest destiny, is the United States of America part of God's plan? I know it sounds so neocon to think it, but it's a worthwhile question if one believes that God acts in history. Now, Ross Dutat didn't go there, but he was mostly on, was it time for the grip of religion in Europe to end? So his article, I'm putting it on my phone because that's why I read the article today. If you want to go to the New York Times and read it, again, it's not a perfect article. It's very suggestive. So now I'm stuck with, do I really believe that God has a plan for history? That part of that plan for history is the liberal state, meaning a state by the people, of the people, for the people, that guarantees individual rights. And we're going to try to work this through in a very imperfect way. Okay? I believe it, and I don't like it that I believe it, because I don't believe that God acts in history and that God has meaning and purpose, but I also do believe that God acts in history and God has meaning and purpose. So the question is, does God act in history? I'm conflicted. My mind can't make sense of it, and my soul says yes. And I'm just going to live in that incoherency. All right, so what does that mean for all of us? I think as a thoughtful person, perhaps you, like I, have to confront ideas that you may not like, but your soul says something else, and we don't have to solve it, which means I'm not going to defend my idea. If you say to me, God does not act in history, America's a horrible country, I'll say I'm not going to argue about that because you can prove your point. If somebody says, Rabbi Finley, I love this idea, God acts in history, the end is the liberal state, and America has preserved that idea more than anybody, I'll say, yeah, that's true. So I can't argue it. I can just say it. I can't really defend it. But why am I thinking about it? Why is this important to me? Because part of Jewish theology is God acts in history. One of God's purposes in history is human redemption. And the greatest vehicle for human redemption is the liberal state. The the rule of citizens articulated through law and branches of government and the protection of human rights. I can't think of a better way for human beings to live. Is it godly? It's scary for me to say it because I don't like to sound like a religiously dogmatic person. But if you were to say to me, is this godly or something else more godly? Well, I think this is godly. And therefore, does God act in history? And does God act in history through the ideas of liberalism? I'll have to say yes. I can't defend it. I'm not going to argue it. I just have to say yes. So now, the only reason I'm thinking about this, I'm offering this to you, is because as a Jew, as a religious person, I have to take the idea of God's acting in history seriously. I might say no, but I have to think about it. So that's what I'm offering you today, as I think I've concluded my series on kind of wandering around in the enchanted force of Jewish theology, creation, revelation, redemption. Redemption meaning, does God act in history? Is taking me to thoughts that I normally don't think about. It took me to this incredible article in the New York Times today. Very glad it was there. I've read it 3 or 4 times and struggled with it. So here I am with you, and I'm just offering to you, if you are a spiritually seeking person and want to ask serious questions about the meaning of life, your meaning of life, theology won't give you the answers, in my opinion, but theology can present to you the array of questions that, as we consider these questions, I think our lives are extraordinarily deepened, and perhaps we are given a light to the moral path before us.